From what I understand, I've had this cat toy quite literally since I was born. I've only ever called it cat, and the pronouns have perpetually changed. And yet, this little toy here is also the inspiration of the series of stories that has hence stuck with me for basically my entire life, at the very latest since I was 4. And obviously those stories have evolved since then to be what they are today, incorporated within the Ragnarök Chronicles. But it's kind of that development and then therefore an overview of those stories that I want to share with you today. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is a channel where I just break down some elements that are going to be in the books that I'm writing. The stories for which this toy cat would be the protagonist were originally called Super Cat, because it was a cat and a cat had superpowers. At that young age, I wasn't really into superheroes at all, the likes of Superman, Batman, etc. Basically for the reason that they were popular, like at that young age, well, that's what everyone else is into, I'm going to be into something else instead. I didn't really give them a chance. I mean, I'm fine with having had that stance. I've since got more into the comic book kind of universe and stuff, especially thanks to the Arrowverse TV shows and others like it, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But at the time, I was kind of in this place where, yeah, I'll have this story, this narrative, with a superpowered alien cat in its own alien worlds, but I just won't care about the other superhero stuff that actually already exists. I'll do my own thing. There then ended up being probably about 90 stories based around Super Cat, which I didn't really structure in the way that books should be structured. So it was always my intention that I would write them that way, but I at the same time was more thinking of them in terms of a TV show, in that you would have seasons within which there would be separate books. There would be 9 seasons, each of a length of 9 for the main stories, as it's 9 books and 9 series, and then there were a handful of other specials that would come either between the series or after the very end as like a spin-off thing. That's why I think it probably comes up to 90 overall. In the years later, when you're looking at around the age of 10, when I first started coming up with the Ragnarök Chronicles as they are right now, obviously to incorporate Super Cat into those kind of larger narratives, obviously changes had to be made. It couldn't just be this story about this superpowered cat going on whimsical adventures, because I probably couldn't realistically justify that within a world that is meant to be set within our own. Already changes were being made. I'd pared the 90 whatever stories down into just 9 books, basically taking each one of the series and saying, okay, rather than it being 9 books in a series, those are going to be like the different plot progression points within each individual book. As for the specials, they could be incorporated somewhere. Even for my younger mind, they weren't as important to the main Super Cat canon because they were kind of more later editions anyway. And then those 9 books in turn got cut down to 7 more recently in turn, as we kind of start to think that actually maybe we could take these arcs from these different stories and again make them more as concurrent plot lines within a single narrative, both so that I'm not stretching for material, because again, from what was originally like, this is a book idea that's now a few chapters, they've in turn were altered as now looking at these as single books, thinking, well actually what is the plot of this story, how do these become more of a continuous thread and so forth. So things already were vastly different to what they were originally. But also because looking at the Ragnarök Chronicles overall, it became clear that even though at the time I had never written a book, it would certainly take some time to do so, and with just how many there were originally planned, some 200 odd, because again, I was at that stage where I was thinking of books more as a structure of a TV show with series and books then within that. Again, this needed to be cut down massively to give me any kind of chance of actually working through it. So again, anything that was a series like that will become to one book, how does the internal structure change, so forth and so forth. And that's how I now have ended up with the 55 number that I'm sure I must have mentioned in the introductory video. The 7 books for the this new series, which obviously is just part of the Calot series, it doesn't have a name individually per se, it's set in like the 2070s probably, something like that, as how the titles like the Ragnarök Chronicles : whatever the year is. That's a way of identifying them. It is still the longest of all of them that I currently have planned. I believe the other longest ones are all like 4 books long. I don't think I have any that are 5 left. Yes, either way, this is definitely longest, but I don't mind that, because again, this was the earliest of the proper stories I've ever had. It does hold a special place to me for that reason, but also I do like the specific fact that it is 7 books. This is where we can get to the planet that this is, at least in some respects, taking place upon, which I have always just used this orange rubber ball to represent. Because it was based around a super cat and cat-based people, the planet became known as Calot, which is just a contraction of there's lots of cats, lots, Calot. And I've stuck with that name, even if I've kind of brushed aside the original intention, because these creatures, while they may have some potentially feline-like features still, again, just as a kind of homage to that original idea, they are definitely not cats anymore, because cats are from Earth. But I'm keeping them Calot, and I've subsequently realised it's kind of like the name Camelot. And since throughout the Ragnarök Chronicles I am making these kind of mythological ties to the other sci-fi stories that I've already created, you know, I could stretch that a little to be more like folklore, legendary. I can incorporate some Arthurian legend in here. And so, that is going to be the main kind of fantastical parallels being made throughout these 7 books, that to Arthurian legend. And again, the reason why I like that it's now 7 books is because kind of in association with Arthur and Merlin and so forth, you sometimes hear about, you know, the 7th son of the 7th son. So number 7 is kind of connected. And then also, in a more literal, or with a bit of wordplay, 7 suns, expand your view away from just the planet to the whole solar system this is taking place in, there are 7 suns, just with a U rather than an O. So, it's not called the Calot system because the Calot is just one planet in it, but I'm going to refer to it as that because I don't have any other name to call it by at this very second. But the Calot system exists at the centre of the universe, at the point where the Big Bang happened, and if you have seen the video talking about, I'm pretty sure it was the one about the structure of the multiverse. I keep referring back to that one, it's clearly an important video, where I talked about Tentortex, the creature that basically renews the cycle of matter within the universe from the end of the chain of universe in the Elf realm, bringing it back around to the beginning. The point where Tentortex breaches through the skin of reality at the very centre, that is the point around which this solar system is centred. Strictly speaking, this point is at the centre of the central star, the sun, at the centre of the solar system, which is far larger than all the rest. Because it's also the site of the rift, which will be talked about again at a subsequent point when we talk more about the main kind of background multiverse-wide conflict that's been going on. Because that's the point that Tentortex goes through. It's a weaker point in space. The rift can come through there. So it's the largest sun in the middle that has ended up expanding more and more because of the energy that's coming through that point, although in such a way that the structure of the star is also altered, so it's not completely destructive to everything that's around it. Then around this central sun, you have 6 more that are orbiting it. Hence, you've got 7 suns in total. And then on average, each of these smaller suns has 2 planets around it in turn, which gives us 12 planets, while the central sun itself mostly just has kind of an asteroid belt around it, although there is 1 planet that's kind of nestled away within there. So I think that's all on that. Brings it up to 13 planets in total. Each which in my original design was, oh, it's a different kind of animals. You've got the mice over here and the dogs over here. Or whatever, again, it's all changed in terms of what kind of creatures live there and whatever. Because also, again, not just going to say it is that earthly animal now on this planet, but also you can have more than one type of creature on a planet. That's going to likely be the case. Even if, you know, only one of them's going to be the dominant species. But you could have multiple as well, depending on the place. Scaling out from that even further, you then find that the entire solar system is encased in a kind of temporal field, which separates it from all of the other kind of reality and universes that spawned outside of it, as well as making the reality inside that bit's slightly different, and I'll get more into the significance of that in a moment. But basically, because, again, this is where originally Tentortex came through, while it largely kind of regurgitated the basic matter from which the universe then developed. So you've got your photons, the hydrogen, whatever. The actual kind of space around this localized spot, what was left behind afterwards, kind of the matter of the Tentortex itself, as that kind of then broke down itself, that gave this localized region a much richer, already developed composition from which matter and planets and so forth could start developing a lot earlier and in a lot more diverse ways. Obviously, scientifically, it can only happen within reason that you could have alternative elements being the basic building block. Like we here on Earth are carbon-based, because carbon is a very versatile element. You cannot, at least in our current understanding of life, say that you would have X element-based life for all of the elements in the periodic table, just because that can't create matter in the same kind of way. And we usually refer to things like silicon-based life form in science fiction as kind of the alternative, and there may be some others that I don't entirely know of. But to the extent that I can, I want to try to say that the different planets have these different main base elements, which will have also affected the kind of life that evolved there and the environments and all of that kind of stuff. But more than it just happening to form this way because you had all this extra material already in place from the Tentortex, there is a matter of a temporal paradox in terms of the creation of the Calot system. Kind of as a safety measure, kind of built into time and the Alpha Realm, to ensure that the loop keeps on happening. What will happen eventually in the distant future is that some people from the Calot system will preserve themselves such that they will last until the end of time. And then they will go, kind of be reawakened to avoid being consumed by Tentortex, but be able to fly with it as it then moves back into the first universe. And they'll be there to witness the beginning of everything. And as part of that, they then will actively help jumpstart the creation of the solar system, thus basically being the longest term grandfather paradox that you can basically get. I think is an ontological paradox, is that the kind of thing it is? Either way, because they cause themselves, they cause the creation of the planets upon which they would eventually evolve and be born, it becomes a fixed time loop. So regardless of what other variations happen, otherwise, there always has to be some form of continuation to prevent this breaking down, and the breakdown of everything, and that's again why it's a temporal field as well, because the timeline of this solar system at the very centre of each universe is kind of stuck on its own path. Obviously things can vary if time travellers interfere, but more than anywhere else, it needs to stay on course as the safety measure for everything. Now, this temporal field is not meant to be broken through. It is meant to be obviously not a solid barrier, but something that you are not meant to be able to either get in or get out of the system because of it. As such, as a side note, I was going to have to consider what does that mean for the perspective of the people inside of this system. Because, well, first of all, what's their day and night cycle going to be like? Based on the fact that there are 7 suns within this system. Of course, some of them are going to be blocked from view by others, but still, like, what's that going to do for these things? And again, they also, because of the temporal barrier, literally nothing gets in or out. There's nothing like starlight coming in from the outside. They're aware that there must be something beyond it. They figured out that it's not the limits of existence, but they are unaware of what is out there. There is one kind of breach at one point, which is sort of like a small localised black hole that formed there due to an aberration just in the formation of the temporal field itself. Yet a black hole is not something that you're really going to go into and find yourself outside the system again afterwards. So that doesn't really work for the people inside. And that being said, at the time of the books, as say, what's probably going to be around the 2070s relative to Earth, although obviously different planets, the technology belonging to the inhabitants of the solar system is advanced enough that they have developed a way to reach out. As part of just the general progression of the systems, as in the planets and systems themselves, the idea is that because these planets are in such close proximity to each other, and they're all inhabited, again, just because of the richness of the environment in the system. Every single one of these planets is inhabited by some species or another. By the time just even the first one of them kind of became spacefaring, they began travelling between each other, and At that point, aside from some cultural differences, they were able to all kind of help each other, massively accelerating the progression of their technological level together, so they became more advanced at a greater rate, for instance, than we have on Earth on our own, albeit with the guidance of the Brethren, Lords and Secrets with the Mansin from the first set of books. So that's where we are right now. There's a much more advanced civilizations together to the point where they have been able to reach out beyond the time barrier in kind of a projection-based way, rather still not physically being able to get out there. Also, just a note I want to clarify and make. I'm talking about how there are cultural differences between the planets and themselves. Of course, in turn, there are going to be cultural differences on each individual planet. All 13 of them, something like that. Because the thing in science fiction sometimes, when a whole planet or people are presented as some like homogeneous unit or environment, not very realistic. I guess under certain circumstances you could justify it. But these people would have, if it wasn't originally natural, they have developed in such a way that they have now become kind of this same homogeneous group, all kind of working towards the same thing with similar feelings. But for the most part, no, you are going to have different cultures within the same world, different subsets, people, different interests in different things. Think about how humans are on Earth. As such, when I do get around to properly, thoroughly planning out, you know, what's it going to be like in all these different places. Obviously, we can't visit everywhere, even over the span of 7 books, but that's what we do visit and get worlds built around, and even maybe just mentioned in kind of the background, like news and stuff. I have to think, well, again, what kind of planets are they? What kind of people are they? What kind of societies are they going to have developed? What kind of stuff has happened in their individual histories? You know, what is their faith systems? Are there any clashes in terms of race and stuff like those? All the things that end up being considered. And so eventually you end up, again, originally mostly focusing on Calot itself, but in general, these different very diverse worlds that we end up visiting. Hopefully you end up building something which, for the reader, at the beginning is this like fantastical new realms and planes that we get to explore. Again, side note, it's kind of really awkward to try to imagine something like a completely new environment. So like, what would be something different that this planet could be that isn't just clearly just a climate on Earth? It's hard to come up with something like that. I mean, I guess it's easier than coming up with a new colour, but hey, we can have fun mixing and matching things there. But as well as obviously just presenting it to the reader, you have to think about the perspective that they are seeing this through in terms of the books, because even though in theory, you know, you could have some kind of narrator just acknowledging these different elements of the world, it's not necessarily going to be conveying the awe that, as a writer, I may wish to be inspiring when describing these kind of environments, if the protagonists are people that already grew up in these worlds. This is the normal for them. So, while I may have kind of alluded before when I talked about kind of the dates and stuff that actually didn't matter that the year was in the 2070s because it's not on Earth, one of the main characters is going to, at least at the beginning, be human. And this now ties back into what these people from Calot did when they called out to the wider universe. So their transmission ended up finding its way all the way to Earth, and specifically was intercepted by one person in particular. There's a reason why he was the one who received the message, but that's kind of a wider, potentially spoilery universe thing, so we won't get into that right now. But it ended up being shot all the way, and again, by a method that meant it got there pretty much instantaneously. Again, the explanation's a bit spoilery. To a character who, for now, I've always been like referring to in my notes as Remy, but as just as a name. But I have more recently decided I actually want the character to be Scottish, so I don't know the etymology of the name Remy, but it might change, basically, is my point. You know, I'm going to keep on calling him Remy for now, because that's what I think of him as. So he gets this call from them, and it's a distress call, to be clear. Because what's actually happening in the Calot system at this point when we join the series is that the collective planets have, for a period of time, been in a state of oppression from one of the race from the planets, who now I'm referring to as the Genies, which as an acronym would be genetically engineered, nanite incarcerated entities. So basically these beings which are encased in a nanobot-designed robotic armour, which I guess makes them kind of cyborgs, but at the same time I also, in my notes, kind of think of them as robots, so I kind of need to make up my mind there as to what, strictly speaking, they are. But anyway, they have been kind of a tyrannical force, kind of oppressing the respective planets, and so this, in a time of need, test call out to the wider universe was to see if anyone could possibly help. So when we picked up the call, despite the fact that he's just a regular person who happens to be visiting the zoo that day, seeing the animals who are also kind of living in their own like virtual reality settings to at least give them the simulation of being back in their natural habitats and so forth. Even though he's just a regular person, he's the only person they've managed to connect to. So they essentially across space relocate him to inside their ship, inside the system. Now, it is said the reality inside of the Calot system is different everywhere else in the Outer Realm. So just as how creatures originating from the Outer Region, such as the Brethren Lords, how they can't naturally survive in the Outer Realm, so too is Remy not really suited to live inside the Calot system. Therefore, as part of the relocation of him, he also was genetically altered. He was transformed into a creature that is more like the residents of Calot. As such, he is now also able to understand them, understand their language. Certain terms will kind of be auto-translated in his head, so anything that's kind of similar, like house or car or equivalent types of food would be turned into the English versions, as well as names. So that's why now, instead of just being Super Cat, the character is now called James, for instance. At least, again, that's the name I'm using. Who in turn now isn't superpowered, but rather is a part of, I guess you could call it a police force for their planets. Again, specifically for Calot, not like in this planetary police force. Obviously in this current state, with the genies currently being in control, they aren't in command in the way they usually should be, so it's more of a resistance group right now. Through Remy, we are now joining these characters in overthrowing the genies, which happens relatively early on, which is why I'm not too fussed about saying that. And then what we get to see is, in terms of a wider worldly standpoint, how the various different societies then respond to suddenly being liberated from this oppression. How do different groups respond? Some of them may turn on each other, still in some kind of social state of anxiety, like clashing over the ownership of heritage items or going to civil war over other things and so forth. Others maybe go completely into the deep end in celebration and so forth. Meanwhile, from the main character's point of view, while throughout Remy is now obviously trying to find a way to go back home, because from what they've seen, this test kind of transmission, it was a one-time thing, they can't get it to work again. So Remy's constantly now having to go through this, first of all, shock that aliens exist, and he's now there, and he's one of them now. And this fact that he may never go home again. Like, even though he wasn't actually that happy with his life on Earth as it was, but now it's one of those things where now that he's completely detached from it, his kind of perspective on all of that is changing, like his worldviews and his views on his relationships with other people and so forth, getting a new perspective put on that. But meanwhile, he's kind of now joining along with James and the rest, because they're the people he's with, in kind of training in the re-establishment of this kind of police force or whatever it is. So these first couple of books in the series we're seeing as a bit more of... See, I've been saying police force, yet part of it's also kind of like spy thriller in thematically, if I'm going to compare it. So kind of like agents and stuff like that. Starting off with those kind of stories, tending off more into a little bit of Private Eye, and then, you know, looking more at the weirdness of the nature of the reality of the system itself. And then slowly, as we're going forward, we're starting to see that the relationships between the different worlds are starting to break down further. It isn't all sunshine and roses after this sudden shift in the power dynamics, until eventually we're kind of... It seems that the different societies are racing towards some other kind of darker calamity in a clash with each other. And we can then see what was originally this kind of bizarre and wonderful and curious environments that the reader and Remy have got to know, how they now might suddenly be seen in a much more dour light. Now, that's something I just find interesting in series in general, when you have that, where it's something that's really positive, like the introduction. Later on, once the public mood starts to take a more negative tone, how that affects and impacts just the general feeling of the settings overall. Just returning to the comment that's about the weirdness of kind of the space and reality within this system, though, because I have a number of elements that I would like to have a go at exploring, within this set of 7 books. And I'm going to have to definitely find a way that I can balance them all out in a way that it doesn't feel crammed and kind of hectic and everything's just being thrown out all over the place. But yeah, there's a number of things I want to try out, such as it being a peculiar spatial region, how it's also resulted in the creation of things that... I don't know if I can go so far as like to say eldritch abominations, but whatever the term is used for entities like Pennywise and Stephen King's Connected Universe, kind of these other not kind of potentially perceived as god-like creatures, a little bit more powerful and mysterious and rarely seen, that could potentially tie into some of the faith systems that we have. But you've got these other mysterious, like cosmic creatures that kind of exist within the peripheries of all these different societies. While we are starting with the genies being in power, I also want to have a go at saying, oh, at some other point in history, you've had these other twins who were previously some notable malevolent influence before they just retreated into the shadows. Now there's a potential threat of them returning. All the while also kind of seeing this through varying character dynamics. Because while at the beginning I definitely want it to be James and Remy as kind of the friends who are going through this, working together and training together, by the time we're getting a little bit into the series, we also have James getting into a relationship, and to be clear, the people of Calot at least, kind of the normal is kind of pansexual, polyamorous relationships, so it's up to you whether you partake in that or not, but that's kind of the norm there. So he's getting into this relationship wherein there are also already children as part of the dynamics. Not originally, in my original plans, it was going to be his kids, but it's kind of, because I definitely don't want to be in a relationship with kids at the beginning, but also by like a certain few books in, I want there to be kids of a certain age that they can play actual like roles within the narrative, so that I can either say that these creatures grow up very quickly, or I can say, well, no, the kids of a pre-existing relationship that he's now joined that dynamic as kind of a co-parent. So first of all, that allows us to also now have these younger characters, the kids, as point-of-view characters for certain stories as well, where the likes of James aren't available for narrative reasons. And also that, again, gives fuel for Remy's further longing to return home. Because even for as much as he may enjoy being around these people and love exploring these worlds, he is still aware that this isn't where he's meant to be. And eventually this is driving him further and further down a path which will lead to challenges within the character dynamics. But that's all stuff that is still to come, as I say. So, it's no longer superpowers. The tone is definitely able to get a bit darker than what the original versions were, but at the same time, hopefully it's still able to generate this same wonderment and adventure, as well as also potentially finding ways to bring back other characters that you may already know if you've read some of the other books by the time I get round to writing these ones. It's ended up with the first book about Calot being the 20th, I believe, which again I just like because it's a good number that it now happens to fall on. So by the time we get to the 20th book out of 55, so 20 through 26, so being these 7 books. Yeah, again, hopefully this is kind of one of the most attached from kind of the grounded Earth narratives that I have. There are some that are even more detached because, again, this still has the link via Remy as a human. But yeah, this should be, as the longest series, as something which is set in completely other worlds, which kind of have unique parameters within which to create this bizarre stuff. It should be a fun kind of sandpit to play around with from a creative writing standpoint. With that, hopefully you have found that interesting overview. So I hope you find other videos on this channel interesting, and until I see you again, just make sure to keep on telling stories.